I'm sure you'd all agree that one of the biggest blessings in life is meeting people who know how to live life well and who become for us good examples. Maybe as you think back a few years, or for the older folks, a lot of years, you could identify specific people that were good examples to you. It might be your mother or your father, or both your mother and father. It might be a grandparent or a pastor that ministered to you, or a mentor, a teacher. We all have benefited from good examples, and we should be, as best as we can, good examples to those that are around us. But good examples aren't perfect examples, because no human being is perfect. And so even when we study good examples in the Word of God, we're not saying that they are perfect. And this should encourage us, because as good of an example as Abraham was, he was imperfect. As good of an example as Moses was, he was imperfect. And therefore, the message of the Bible is not be like Abraham or be like Moses or be like Sarah, but pursue the God of Abraham and the God of Moses and the God of Sarah. Nevertheless, good examples do provide us with a bit of a framework. They help us to understand how to exercise our faith in space and time. They provide us with a paradigm that's worth emulating. And we've seen several of these people identified in Hebrews chapter 11, which is a wonderful chapter outlining several great examples of faith for us. And so far in our series called Things Unseen, we've made our way through the period of the patriarchs. We've studied Abraham and, of course, those that came in the antediluvian period as well, right back to Abel. But we studied Abraham, went through the patriarchs. We discussed Moses, the man that God chose to lead his people out of Egypt. But now we are presented with a corporate example of faith, Israel, on two occasions. Now, obviously, the corporate Israel is composed of individuals of faith, but the focus of the writer of Hebrews is on the collective faith of Israel as they left Egypt. Not a perfect faith. They messed up a few times. They lacked faith on occasion. But there are at least two occasions that are worth studying and reflecting upon where they really stepped out in faith and did some amazing things. And I thought this would be a great sermon, because hopefully each of you has been challenged in your individual faith, but let's just challenge our whole church now collectively. We not only want to be individuals of faith, but we want to be a church collectively, corporately, that is marked by faith in God. And so as we consider the Israelites, we want to consider their corporate faith. We also want to acknowledge that their corporate faith largely flowed from the faith of their leaders of households, leaders of clans, leaders of tribes, Moses, Aaron, Miriam, the leaders of the nation collectively. And our church wants to increase in our faith. We want to be a faithful people that is known for being very faithful to the things of God in our community. So here's what we read in Hebrews chapter 11, which is our text, Hebrews chapter 11, verses 29 through 30. You can follow along in your Bible or on the screen. By faith, the people crossed the Red Sea as on dry land, but the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. Now, these two events take place 40 years apart. One in and around 1446 BC and the other around 1406 BC. But both of them pertain to Israel's collective faith in God. The one takes place during the period of the Exodus. The other takes place at the commencement of the conquest, as the people had crossed the Jordan River, were on the plains of Gilgal, and were about to attack Jericho. Now, both of these accounts are different. The generation that crossed the Red Sea was a different generation than those that attacked Jericho, but both of them involve an insurmountable obstacle. One is a Red Sea, and the other are the walls of Jericho. And both of them, interestingly, also feature a wall. One is a wall of water through which God protects his people from drowning, and through which God destroys the Egyptian army. And the other is a stone wall that was designed to keep people out of Jericho, which needed to be conquered in order for the people to make headway into the land of Canaan. And in both of these instances, God brings the wall down and destroys his enemies. He brings the wall of water down and destroys the Egyptians. And in Jericho, he brings the wall down, which results in the destruction of the pagans in Jericho. And we are taught then, early on in the text, that no obstacle, no matter how high, no matter how thick, no matter how insurmountable, is too great for God, and that God can actually utilize obstacles, barriers, roadblocks, things that are put in the way as a means of not only delivering his people, but also destroying his enemies, and thirdly, bringing himself a lot of glory. And so when we consider the obstacles that we may experience in our own lives, metaphorically or perhaps literally, that stand in the way of our faith, that cause us to second guess whether or not God is on our side, that cause us to question how in the world we're going to move forward one more day in our relationships, in our Great Commission ministry, in our ministries, we can be reminded from these texts that no obstacle is too great when God gives us the faith and when God acts, and he can push them all down. And he really is that powerful. So to fully benefit from these instances of faithfulness, I want to go back to the original event. And so we'll start with the Red Sea event. And you can read about that in Exodus chapter 14. And then we'll go over to Joshua chapter 6 to read more deeply on the Jericho event. But let's start with Exodus 14. And we're going to look at verses 14 through 18 and then skip down and also take note of verse 21. So as you find your way there, the background is this, that Israel had been captive in Egypt for 400 years. And through a series of circumstances, God raised up Moses. Moses goes to Pharaoh and he says repeatedly, "Let my people go." And Pharaoh's answer is always no. We learn about the sovereignty of God in there because in several of the events, it says God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And then in several of the events, it says Pharaoh hardened his own heart. So Pharaoh is hardening his heart. He's expressing his depravity, and God is also sovereignly hardening his heart. So that's kind of some interesting theological dynamics going on there as human sinfulness is being expressed, but God is also using this godless man for his own purposes. God is very much in control of Pharaoh. Well, after the Passover event, where a great number of the firstborns of Egypt in the flocks and in the households were killed, Pharaoh finally relents and he says, "Okay, you can go, get out of Egypt." So the people plunder the Egyptians, take a lot of their wealth, and they head out into the wilderness. But very soon they find a problem. They come up against the Red Sea. Now, the Red Sea isn't like 3 blocks away. It's actually several hundred kilometers away. So they've been traveling for a while. They come up to the Red Sea and they're like, what are we going to do now? And in their faithlessness, remember, I said good examples aren't perfect examples. They start to whine and they start to complain. Well, in the meanwhile, Pharaoh's back in Egypt and he's suddenly thinking to himself, what in the world did I do? I just lost perhaps 1 million some odd free laborers. And I want them back. So he sends his armies off into the desert, and they encounter the Israelites wandering around on the shores of the Red Sea, trying to figure out what they're going to do next. Now, I need you to picture in your mind how insurmountable of an object the Red Sea was for the Israelites. Keep in mind that the Israelite people were primarily a land-loving people. Yeah, they did some inland fishing on the Sea of Galilee, but they weren't like the Phoenicians that took to the Mediterranean. They were a land-loving people. They weren't much into swimming. They weren't much into building ships. And we know this because time and time again in the Bible, the sea is envisioned as a place of chaos and death and destruction. In other words, in the minds of the ancient Israelites, water was for the most part dangerous. And here they had this obstacle, and they didn't have their scuba gear with them. And they didn't have boats that they'd brought along, and they weren't a seafaring people. They'd spent 400 years in Egypt. And to make matters worse, the Red Sea is not some shallow body of water. Now, there's some disagreement as to the precise point at which they crossed the Red Sea. But I want you to hear these facts. If the Israelites had attempted to cross the shallowest point of the Red Sea, brace yourself for this, they would have had to cross a body of water that was 250 meters deep. If they crossed at a deeper point in the Red Sea, they would have had to try to traverse a body of water that went down to an astonishing 1,000 feet deep. So this is insurmountable. This is an incredibly deep abyss. Compare that to the Jordan River. The Jordan River ranges in depth from 1 foot to, at certain times of the year, 200 feet deep, but nowhere near the depth of the Red Sea. This was literally an insurmountable obstacle for them. And as they're there on the shore of the Red Sea, and as the Egyptians are thundering up to them with their armies, listen to what God says to his people in verse 14. The Lord will fight for you. I want you to burn that phraseology into your mind and never forget it. This is God's word of hope to his covenant people through all of time. When we are incapable, and we always are, when we experience insurmountable obstacles, hear these words from God. The Lord will fight for you. God is for us as his people. He is not against us. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent. He needed to say that because they'd fallen into the trap of whining and complaining and questioning and bickering and accusing and all that sort of stuff that bubbles up in our flesh when we're under great stress or duress. God said, just be quiet. I got this. I'm going to fight for you. And then, as is true to God's work in history, he uses human instruments to accomplish his purposes. So he speaks to Moses, their leader. And the Lord said to Moses, why do you cry to me? Tell the people of Israel to go forward. Forward where? Into the Red Sea. Lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it. And that the people of Israel may go through the sea on dry ground. God even dried out the floor of the sea. He didn't leave it all squishy and muddy. Even the seabed was dry. And I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they shall go in after them, and I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his hosts, his chariots and his horsemen. There we have it, folks. What do we often say? The mission of God is the glory of God. And here again, God is rescuing his people, but ultimately for his own glory. So we have the reason behind the reason. He's going to rescue his people, but God will get glory for himself. Even when tyrants rise up and ravage his people, God will ultimately get glory through their destruction. And this is a theme that is woven from the beginning of the Bible to the end of the Bible. And it's going to come true in our lives as well. God will crush his enemies and give himself glory even through your suffering and through the obstacles that are thrown up in front of you. Then verse 18, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. He uses his covenant name. When I have gotten glory over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. I love it when God repeats himself, because then you can't miss it. Twice now, God is going to get himself glory through the destruction of Pharaoh. Then jump down to verse 21. In obedience, then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back, all 250 to 1,000 meters deep of it. These are walls of water. You wouldn't be able to see them. You wouldn't be able to see the top of them if you're at the bottom of the seabed. Maybe you read the storybook where they're kind of a little high and there's fishies floating by. You wouldn't be able to see the top. They could be up to 3,000 plus feet tall, even if they didn't break the surface of the sea. It's an astonishing event. I wish there was cameras back then. It'd be nice to see a picture of all this. The Lord drove back the sea by a strong east wind all night and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. God fights for his own. I hope you're one of his own, because if you ain't, you're his enemy. You're either his friend or you're his enemy. You're either in covenant or you are his foe. But God fights for his own. And so when we experience insurmountable obstacles that have been thrown up, not because of our own foolishness, but because of our faithfulness, we don't need to yell at God. We don't need to wander around in circles, pacing and carrying on and complaining and whining or freaking out to try to get his attention. That's what the pagans do. Was it not Elijah the prophet that mocked the priest of Baal, who ran around screaming and hollering and rolling around, carrying on in order to try to get their God's attention? He mocked them. How foolish that is. You don't need to put on a show. You don't need to pray for 3 hours straight before God picks up the phone, folks. The Lord's Prayer is not a lengthy prayer, but it's a full prayer. You can pray it in about 90 seconds. We don't need to carry on and freak out and get anxious or worry, which, by the way, are sins. We need to trust in the Lord. We pray, and then we wait in silence for God to act. God's like, chill out. Relax. Stop freaking out. Christians should be the most chill people in culture. Not chill as in passive, lackadaisical, lacking focus, but we should not be a people marked by anxiety. We should not be a people marked by worry. Shouldn't be chewing our fingernails down to the flesh. Should be laying awake at night, breathing heavy, trying to get some sleep because we're so concerned about what tomorrow holds. As we put our faith in the Lord and are silent before God, we can hear these words throughout time. God will fight for you. He loves you. Now, I want you to notice also that when God parts the Red Sea, the Israelites had to act. And as the Red Sea is parted, Israel steps out and they put their foot on the bottom of the Red Sea. And they start the perilous journey down and across the bottom and up the other side. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people marched across the seafloor to safety on the other side. It must have been quite a sight. And that would have taken a lot of courage in that moment. Like, I don't know about this. I hope the winds don't stop and the water suddenly crashes down upon us. But I want you to also note that the Israelites do the exact same, or the Egyptians rather, do the exact same thing. They also step out onto the seafloor in pursuit of the Israelites. The Israelites had courage, and the Egyptians have courage. So therefore, faith has to be a whole lot more than courage. There's a lot of people that are very courageous people. I mean, you got to be a courageous person to strap a parachute on and jump out of a perfectly good plane, thousands of feet from the earth. You have to be a very courageous person to storm across a battlefield during the Great War or World War II and attack the enemy, even if you're a German. I mean, you got to have courage to do that. So faith, brothers and sisters, is far, far more than courage. I mean, it's not less than courage. We need to have courage. God said to Joshua, be strong and courageous. We have to be courageous, but courage is not the sum total of faith. Believers must be courageous, but unbelievers can also exercise a whole lot of courage as well. In fact, pretty much anybody could theoretically have courage, bravery to do something that's kind of scary. So what then is faith? Well, faith is courage with a noble goal in a noble guide who is God. If you don't have a noble goal, if you have an ignoble goal, if you have an ignoble guide like the Egyptians did, their goal was to destroy life. Their goal was to bring honor to their Pharaoh god. Those are not noble goals, and the Pharaoh's not a noble guide, but the Israelites had courage, but it was with a noble goal and a noble guide who was God, and that is what made their faith adorable to God. That's what made their faith adorable to God. And therefore, our faith has to be more than courage. It has to have a noble goal, and it has to be rooted in a noble God in order for it to be true faith. Now, we all know that our faith ebbs and flows. There's times when our faith is a little wobbly, and there's times when it just seems like, bring it on, devil. Our faith ebbs and flows, but if you want less ebbing and more flowing, what you have to do is you have to fixate not on the circumstances, but you have to put your eyes on the noble goal, and you have to keep your eyes on the noble God who has given you a mandate. And for the Israelites, yes, the immediate goal is to get to safety, but the macro goal is to get to the promised land. 400 years later, this was a desire that Joseph expressed on his deathbed when he said, take my bones to the promised land. I want to be buried in the promised land. This is a goal that Abraham had a couple generations before that when he purchased a grave, the only piece of real estate he owned in the promised land to bury his wife. These were like down payments. These were monuments. These were reminders of the ultimate goal. So in crossing the Red Sea, it would have been easier to stay in Egypt, I suppose. In fact, there's times when the people even question whether they'd made a good decision. But here they're focused on the promised land. That's the noble goal. And you have a promised land that you need to fixate on as well. You need to remain kingdom-minded. You need to make sure that you know you're headed toward your promised land and that you are being guided by your faithful God. And that faithful God will sometimes allow insurmountable obstacles to arise in front of you, but then he will also part the sea for you. And he will enable you to walk across dry seabeds in faith and in wonder of God. The cool thing about the miracles that God commits time and time again in the Bible is that there's just no mistake. This could not have happened by human circumstances or weather patterns. God was clearly involved. So lesson number one is make sure that you have a noble goal and a noble guide and stay true to him no matter what. And then the second example of faith that the writer of Hebrews reintroduces us to is the Jericho event. And most of you have heard of the city of Jericho. It is almost without dispute that Jericho is the oldest continually inhabited city on the face of the planet. And it's almost without dispute that Jericho was the first walled city ever built in human civilization. So this is a pretty significant place. And when God, 40 years later, now under Joshua, sends the Israelites across the Jordan, and they're hanging out at Gilgal, which is right beside Jericho. And they're like, well, we gotta eventually take this whole land. God has given it to our forebears. Obstacle number one is the oldest city on earth with a very big wall. And in their flesh, they might have been thinking to themselves, well, can't we start with that little Bedouin village over there with like 5 people in it? Build up a little bit of self-esteem here and self-worth. And God's like, you're going to take that city. And through my work, those walls are coming down. And so we read about this in Joshua chapter 6. And I want to pick up on the episode right in verse 1, and then we'll kind of touch down on several sections here. But look at the first couple of verses of Joshua 6. Now Jericho was shut up inside and outside because of the people of Israel. So everyone had ran inside, closed the doors, closed the gates, closed the windows. None went out and none came in. And the Lord said to Joshua, just very matter-of-factly, see, I have given Jericho into your hand with its king and its mighty men of valor. Great. What's the military plan, God? Should we start building a catapult to fire bomb the city? Should we start building ladders? You can imagine this would be going on in your mind, to scale the wall. Should we start tunneling under the wall? Should we send more spies inside of the wall to open the gate so we can all rush in? Should we sneak in under the cover of darkness? Like, okay, we got the city now, but what are we going to do? Now, keep in mind, the Israelites were entirely untested in the area of battle. Never in their national history had they fought any wars. They had no experienced veterans. They had never attacked a city of any sort. And the first city that God pits them against is none other than the great city of Jericho. And instead of forming up a classical military strategy, God proposes a plan that would make them look like a bunch of idiots for 7 days straight. That would make them look foolish and expose them to public mockery for an entire week, almost always in silence, with the exception of a few key points. They had to blow a trumpet or shout. It's like, here's my plan. I want you to get all your men together, and I want you to just start walking around the city. Okay, so are we going to fire arrows? Just walk around the city. Day one, just walk around the city and then go home. And then go back the next day and just walk around the city. And then another day, just walk around the city. You can imagine, what are these morons doing? Just every day, just walking around our city? But they're walking around the city, and every once in a while there's a trumpet blast or an assigned shout, but that's about it. Just walk around the city and look like a bunch of idiots. Verse 3 describes it as follows. You shall march around the city, all the men of war going around the city once. Thus you shall do for 6 days. 7 priests shall bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. On the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. And when they make a long blast at the ram's horn, when you hear the sound of the trumpet, then all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city shall fall flat, and the people shall go up, everyone straight before him. So Joshua, the son of Nun, called the priests and said to them, take up the ark of the covenant, let 7 priests bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord. And he said to the people, go forward, march around the city, and let the armed men pass on before the ark of the Lord. Now, there's no record of any objections. They just march around the city for 7 days. Didn't fire an arrow, didn't throw a stone. You can imagine the people in Jericho, hey, goofballs, what are you doing? When are you going to attack? Are you scared? What do you think you're doing? You can imagine we don't know how far out from the wall they were, but probably could hear some taunting going on. And then in verse 20, if we pop down, so the people shouted, and the trumpets were blown. And as soon as the people heard the sound of the trumpet, the people shouted a great shout, and the wall fell down flat. That's it. After all this marching, the wall just falls down. So the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they captured the city. And then they performed what's called a ban. They devoted the city to destruction. And it might sound cruel to you, but it's like everything that marked the city's existence has to go. Therefore, the warriors that had been marching around the city didn't get any loot. This was all for God. There was no material benefit to them. Then they devoted all the city to destruction, men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, donkeys, with the edge of the sword. And Jericho falls flat. And the first city that the Israelites would see, when you cross the Jordan River, first thing you see, slightly to the north and to the west, is Jericho. That's obstacle number 1, and it's a formidable obstacle. God deliberately sent them toward it, and the city fell flat. And you can imagine how that would have galvanized them to think, well, if we can take Jericho, we can take the whole land. And in both cases, in both the Red Sea event and then in the Jericho event, it's notable that God asked his people to do something that humanly was impossible to accomplish. Let that ruminate in your mind a little bit. That's faith, brothers and sisters. Faith is trusting God to remove obstacles when the earthly probability is zero. That's faith. Faith is trusting God to remove obstacles in the earthly probability. If you're a mathematician, you might know some equations about figuring out probability. This is zero. There's no chance whatsoever that would happen. You don't march around cities and they just fall flat. That just doesn't happen. You know, some skeptics, well, maybe they did. Maybe there was a seismic issue and they just happened to stomp at the same time as a little earthquake came through. No, this was the work of God. God predicted it and it happened. Now you can understand more fully why we know that faith is trust in things unseen, but that have been guaranteed by God alone. This is so critical for us to understand. As North Americans, we are so hungry for empirical evidence for everything. We want material causes to be explained. We want to use formulas or philosophical reasoning to prove. I need proof. God's like, I'll give you, here's what your confidence is going to be in. It's going to be in my word. If I say it, it's true. And I'm going to tell you straight up, if you don't believe that, you ain't going to be in church 10 years from now. Your faith will not survive unless you understand, unless your starting point is God said it, therefore it's true. If God's revelation is not enough for you, and instead you need to use your reason to arrive at truth, and we're not anti-rational, by the way, but foundational to the Christian faith is the word of God, what God has said. And if God says go, you get your butt in gear and you go. You don't complain, you don't whine, you don't delay. Now these marchers that marched around the wall, I want to note this, they had courage too. But without faith, this was just a ridiculous display of religiosity, superstition perhaps. And yet as an act of grace toward Israel and as an act of wrath toward Jericho, the Israelites win and the sinners are destroyed, which is the meta-narrative of history. The righteous will be rescued and evildoers will be completely and entirely destroyed. Now, lest we think that righteousness is inherited, we have in Jericho one woman who was rescued, and her name is Rahab. And she is not the chief apostle of the local charismatic church. And she is not the seasoned preacher of the local Baptist church. And she's not the head of a local soup kitchen performing all sorts of charitable deeds for everyone else. And she is not the mayor of the city with all sorts of political clout. She's a prostitute. And yet she is obedient to God. And this becomes a reminder to us that God exercises grace toward the least expected. And she actually ends up in the line of our Savior as one of his foremothers. So great reminder, God will reward the righteous and destroy the wicked, but don't assume you're part of the righteous just because you're hanging with righteous people. God often plucks out of despicable circumstances world changers that are impacted by his grace and do mighty things for him. Well, this is a monumentous event because, as I mentioned, Jericho is the first city you'd see when you cross the Jordan. And the decisive win that they had there would pave the way for a series of wins that they would experience in the future. As they were faithful to God, God would give them wins. And when they fell back and got a little rebellious or lazy, God would give them a few losses along the way. And so taking the land of Canaan wasn't easy. Sometimes they won when they were faithful, and sometimes they lost when they were unfaithful. But this was an event that would go down in the annals of Israeli history, that God can do the impossible through faithful people that have a noble goal in mind and who trust in their noble guide. It's notable, too, that this 7 days of marching means that they had to expose themselves to almost 7 days of embarrassment. It is the equivalent of taking a public stand for Christ and being incessantly mocked for it, which you will be. You ever been called a loser because you're a Christian? Have you ever been mocked? I remember years ago, we moved into a new neighborhood in South Windsor back in the day, and I went down the street to meet my neighbor. He was a fellow that grew up in communist China and grew up in atheism. He wasn't a believer, and we got chatting. I said, "Oh, where do you work?" And he told me, and then he said, "What do you do?" And I said, "Well, I'm a pastor." And he immediately went, Well, that's not normally how I perceive Chinese people. I mean, Chinese people, and I've been to China, are usually very polite and very kind and maintain their poise. But he was mocking me because I was a Christian. And that's just a small example of the Christian life. Expect to be laughed at. Expect to be mocked in public. When you take a public stand for God, especially when there's no immediate result. Hey, weren't you picketing here yesterday around the abortion clinic? Nothing's changed, dude. Weren't you praying over that sick person in the hospital last week and you're going back, but they're still there? Like, clearly your God doesn't care about them. When we take a public stand for Christ, we're going to be mocked. And yet we must learn to obey God without empirical evidence more often than not for lengthy periods of time until God breaks through and does the impossible. And that's the point. Because that's how God gives himself glory in a skeptical world. Now, if you don't learn that lesson, and if I don't learn that lesson, we are not going to survive our Canaan. Not going to happen. As we come up against hostile forces, as we experience insurmountable obstacles in our own day and age, we're not going to last. We're just going to assimilate with the Canaanites unless we learn to trust God for the impossible. So I want to leave you with 3 questions for you to mull over in your mind in response to what we've studied. The first one is this: what are the obstacles that are standing before you? As God has called you to be a faithful, Great Commission Christian, faithful in your marriage, faithful in your ministry, faithful in your relationships, faithful in your career, faithful in your schooling, what are the obstacles that keep popping up? They may not be city walls, they may not be bodies of water, but if you're on mission for Christ, there's going to be some obstacles. What are those obstacles? You thinking about them? Second question is, what are the promises of God that have informed your response to those obstacles? If you've never done a study in the promises of God, you probably should. What are the promises of God? What has God promised his people? I mean, one of them is that God will fight for us, but there's many, many more that have informed how you've processed that obstacle, that barrier, that wall, that body of water. And the third question is, how are you responding right now? Are you appropriating those promises? Are you applying them? Are you putting them into practice? Or are you chewing on your fingernails, guzzling Tums and Pepto-Bismol to try to calm your stomach because you're so worked up about the obstacle? We need a fresh vision of God every day in order to make it. And we serve a God who is faithful, who fights for his people, who loves us, who cares for us, who sent his eternal Son to die for us. He is pro-you. He is pro-you because you are one of his own. So be profoundly encouraged by these words and allow them to motivate you to continue to put your faith in the true and living God.